Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Steph, and thank you, Dan, for the introduction. And hello, everyone. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. I think that's number one. So in terms of my role, I'm a partner with KPMG's management consulting practice, and in particular with our People and Change group. And our People and Change group deals with anything to do with people, with the workforce, as well as with things like change management. I've been involved in this field for more than 20 years, and both in Canada and internationally across many different industries. And right now, I think like a lot of people on this call, my main focus is COVID-19 and helping our clients deal with COVID-19, but also start planning for returning to the workplace. So I'm happy for the opportunity today to walk you through a guide that we put for organizations in helping them plan and execute the return to their workplace. And I think there is one individual who has raised their hand, Kevin. I'm not sure if there is a question, if they can hear me or not.
Don't see any questions to me,
Okay.
Stavros. Yeah,
okay,
not
no
yet,
worries.
so, yeah.
So I'm gonna go off camera now so that you don't have any additional distractions. And I'm gonna walk you through this guide that we've put in place, and you will notice that we've explicitly called this guide "Return to the Workplace" instead of "Return to Work" because most of us have already been working, right? So throughout the pandemic, and in some cases even more than before. So of course, a lot of the organizations offering essential services have already been working on site, and we want to thank them for that, like for keeping those essential services going. And this guide that we put together is a comprehensive framework of all the things that organizations need to consider in bringing their people back to the workplace, and to help them put a solid plan in place to do that, as well as to help them review maybe a plan that they already have in place, or to sustain a plan once they started executing it. From what we're hearing and seeing, many organizations are already considering bringing employees back to their workplace. These numbers right now from the clients that I'm talking to are still fairly low. Of course, they vary by industry and location. In some of my estimates and my colleagues' estimates, we're anticipating around 10 to 25% of people back until September. So some of them are starting right now, like in June or the summer. A lot of them are planning to get back in September, and some of them even don't have any plans to get back until January. So it really varies, and it depends on, again, like the industry, the location, the organization. At KPMG, for example, we're planning to start going back to work from July. However, again, it will vary by region, and it will be on a needs basis. I'd like to make this an interactive session. So please, at any point in time, if you have any questions or any comments, or want to share any of your own experiences, please raise your hand and ask those questions, because it's important for all of us to learn from one another. And before we jump into the details here, I wanted to share a few of the guiding principles that that we're seeing around the return to work, and some of the assumptions that we're making. So in terms of the guiding principles, obviously the top priority, and I think this applies to absolutely everyone, the top priority is the health and safety and well-being of employees and your visitors to your organization. So that's the #1 priority.
Hey, Stavros,
Yeah.
sorry to jump in. I think you might be sharing the wrong screen. Do you want to, we don't see anything on your screen.
Oh, I do? Steph, you can't see anything?
Can you not see my screen?
I can.
Might be user.
Dan,
Okay.
Dan, can you see the
If
screen?
other people can see it, then I'll find the second screen.
Yeah. Okay, Dan can as well. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks, Steph. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. People said they could see it.
Yeah. Okay. No worries.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for reporting back on that. Thank you.
Yeah. In terms of the ownership of this plan, we've seen HR playing a central role across most organizations, but it's not a plan that's being owned just by one department or one functional area. This is a cross-organization-wide plan, and you need to have people from legal, quality, risk management, health and safety involved as well. To make sure that you cover a number of different considerations and risks that your organization will need to address prior to getting your people back to work. And our recommendation is also making sure that you abide, of course, with the health recommendations from government, and if you can engage with a local medical professional as well, that would be, over and above, that would be a great addition, to your plan. In terms of the assumptions that we made here, COVID-19 is here to stay. We believe that it's not going to go away until there is a vaccine or an effective treatment in place. I mean, hopefully, ideally, it will go away on its own, but I don't think that will happen like it happened with some other epidemics in the past. For that reason, we should be planning for a period of time where there might be a hybrid environment, a hybrid way of working with both virtual workers as well as on-site workers, and virtual customers as well as on-site customers. So that's gonna be around, at least probably until next summer, which I think is the optimistic estimate, for a vaccine being deployed, globally. We're hoping that will be earlier, but that's the scenario that we're working with right now. And I've talked about the government. The government has a critical role to play in this whole thing. There's a number of things that the government is doing. Number one, they're establishing risk levels, for each location and each region, and that's important. That's important for organizations to look at and follow, to make sure that those are being, are being complied with, and also they are the ones that they're providing guidelines in terms of, when is it appropriate for restrictions to be lifted, how many people can concur in one place together, all those things. So make sure when you're building your plan that you're looking at all the government guidelines as well. That's a very important consideration. So going into the 4 different phases of the crisis, and these are consistent. We've seen different models out there, but these are consistent, I think, with most of those models. And the first stage of this crisis was the reaction phase. Basically, we had to overnight, basically, transition quickly to remote working and implementing our business continuity plans. That happened to all of us overnight. Many companies never worked remotely before, and they were able to do it over a weekend. It was unbelievable. It was a great thing to see. And that speaks a lot about the resilience of organizations, which is the second phase. And basically this phase is around learning to live with COVID-19, learning to deliver work remotely, and enabling your workers to be able to work effectively remotely as well. So this is where most organizations still are. And the following phase after that is the recovery phase. So the recovery phase is basically around slowly and safely getting employees back to their workplace. And a lot of organizations, as I said, have already started doing that, but most organizations are still at the beginning of the planning process for this. Of course, I'll be interested in hearing from all of you later on in this session to hear where you all are, whether you are already back in the workplace or you're still in the planning process. So it's, but for most organizations, from what we're hearing, like this is still, pretty early days before at least getting like all of their employees back to their workplace. And then the final phase of this crisis, which is a very important phase, is around the new reality. So what we mean by new reality is it would have been a lost crisis if we don't learn anything from this pandemic. So there's a number of things, for example, that can be automated, a number of processes that can be done more efficiently. There is the use of digital means nowadays through the pandemic that has reached up unprecedented levels, right? So all of those learnings, how can we take those learnings and fit them into the new reality? So what would that new workplace look like? What should our workforce be in the future? What skills and capabilities do our people need to have to operate in that new environment? And do we need all the people that we currently have in the roles that we currently have them in? Or how are those roles going to change? How do we need to hire for those roles or train for those roles? So there's a number of workforce-related questions and workplace and technology-related questions that go into that new reality.
Yes.
Kevin, are there any questions? Please let me know if any questions come through, because
yes.
I'm not monitoring the questions as they...
The first question I have, Stavros, is there are some community leaders from different towns around, cities and towns around Canada, asking if they can share this document publicly with their civic teams.
Yes,
Okay.
it's a public document. Yeah,
okay, perfect. Sure. Thank you. Again,
yeah.
I just reposted the link to the document as well. So thank you. And I've just let everybody know via chat that if you want to chat, just raise your hand and we'll work you into the conversation here. I'll unmute you and let you talk. But right now we're good to go, Stavros. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm gonna move quickly through some of these introductory slides to get into the framework that we've built. But I think it's still important to cover, to position this the right way. I get a lot of questions around, why should we get people back? Like our people don't want to come back, like they're working well as things are. We haven't seen a lapse in productivity. Some people may have seen a lapse in productivity, but many of the clients I'm talking to, they're saying like productivity hasn't really been impacted as much. Of course, there is, other issues like, people being fatigued or, mental health is becoming like an issue because of people working independently and remotely. However, one of the biggest reasons why it's important to safely plan the return of employees to the workplace is that there is a link between returning to the workplace and public confidence and trust. And public confidence and trust is critical to economic recovery. So you will see here, once we start returning to the workplace, that can help increase the public confidence, and eventually that can help with the economic recovery as well. So I just wanted to share that here just to show the importance of of eventually getting people, obviously safely, back to work. In terms of the return to work, in terms of the plan itself, most organizations that we talk about, they're not talking about a big bang approach. They're talking about a phased return plan to work. And there's a few questions that need to be answered and factors taken into consideration to make a decision as to where and when to reopen, and prioritizing who should be working on site. There is the community risk level, which basically is the risk level that's being shared by public health officials around the infection rates in a certain community. And there is the facility risk level, which is the risk level for the specific building or facility, which in both of those risks could be similar or consistent, or they could be different. So it's important to look at both of those first before making any decision around where and when to reopen. In terms of prioritizing, who should be working on site, there's again a few things to consider here. The first one is for the specific job or function, how possible is it to do that job remotely? What's the extent to which the tasks involved with that job can be done virtually? That's an important consideration, because if they can be done virtually, maybe it's not worth the risk of bringing those individuals back into the office. Then what's the need for in-person interaction for a specific job or function? Again, similarly, some jobs may need to be, done in person. However, we need to challenge some of those assumptions as well, because we've seen examples of people who were even sales consultants and they used to do that job in person, and now they're becoming digital marketing influencers, for example. So it's important to look at the job, but also look at what's possible and what's not possible. It's also very important to look at your employee groups who may have underlying conditions, or who may be living with at-risk dependents at home. So those groups obviously would not be part of an initial wave of returning to work. And the last factor here that should be taken into consideration is around the group sentiment overall. Are people feeling comfortable working on site and returning to work? I've had a roundtable today with some technology clients, and they've done surveys with their employees around returning to work, and overwhelmingly, like one client said, 76% of their employees don't want to return to work. Obviously, you shouldn't be making the decision just on, whether, people want to come back or not, but it's an important consideration, because employees need to be, to feel comfortable returning to work. And they can deny, from an occupational health and safety perspective, they can deny getting back to work if they feel the organization hasn't taken the right precautions to make sure that it is safe for them to get back to work. And as I've mentioned earlier, there will be a period of time where we're gonna need to learn to live with a hybrid environment, where we have people working in the office, but also people still working at home. And for those people that are still remote workers or virtual workers, we need to put the right policies and practices in place to enable their integration with the rest of the workforce, but also to enable things like cybersecurity, confidentiality, and sharing of information. ability to, help them manage their time and their performance while they're, working remotely, their health and safety long-term while they're working remotely. It was okay, at first, in the first 1 or 2 months, to send everyone home because obviously we had the pandemic, and then they can work from their kitchen table or whatever. But long term, if that leads to an issue with some of your employees, that's something you need to have into you need to address and take into consideration. So there's a lot of things that you need to consider around both your workers that will come back to work on site, as well as your remote workers. And now I think we're moving into the meat of the presentation, and this is the framework that I've said that we've put in place. And before I go into the details of the framework, I just wanted to share that we see 3 main stakeholder groups that are heavily involved and impacted by the return to the workplace. And if I start from the right, going clockwise, so the first stakeholder group is around the task force and those responsible for the governance and managing the risk, for returning to work. This could be, your legal team as well. And you need to consider before obviously finalizing your return to work plan, what information does this task force and this group need to have? What are the different risks that they need to take into consideration? What are some of the policy and governance components that they need to consider and address around bringing people safely back to their workplace? The second stakeholder group is your employees as well as your visitors' health and safety. So for those 2 groups, obviously, the 2 biggest groups, what information do I need to provide to my employees and to my visitors to ensure their health, safety, and well-being? And as I said, there is some legal considerations here as well, because employees need to feel that those precautions, and the visitors need to feel that those precautions have been put in place to reduce, you cannot eliminate the risk, but to reduce the risk of them getting an infection while at work. And the last stakeholder group includes all, your facility and operation managers, as well as your back office functions, IT, HR, and finance. And again, what information do they need to have, to be able to determine, for example, which workforce groups, they need to bring back into their workforce first, or which workforce groups are critical to work on site. What technology supports do you need to have in place to enable them to work, from the office? What are some of the physical requirements or changes that you need to put in place to enable that? The 2 meters, for example, physical distancing and other such considerations. And our framework is broken down into 23 categories, basically, of actions that need to be taken around those 3 main categories. So, and behind each one of these 23 categories of actions, we have a very detailed, comprehensive list of an additional 400 action items that fall across those 23 categories. So I'm not going to go through, obviously, all 400 items here, but I just wanted to show you the different considerations and actions that you need to take with regards to each one of these 3 stakeholder group needs. So there's things like, the role of the board committee, for example, the role of the task force, There is the returning to work, the workplace approach that needs to be put in place. You need to do an insurance review or an employment law and legal review. From an employee and visitor health and safety perspective, you need to have the right personal protective equipment in place. You need to have like the cleaning materials in place, or like the cadence for cleaning like the different offices. You have to adhere to different physical distancing guidelines. From a workplace preparation and management perspective, these include things like, how are you gonna manage, cases when they come up? What are the protocols around contact tracing? There's also technology components here around, access, not just to technology, but also to the physical space, of individuals. And also there's the big component around the workplace redesign and improvement, which, as I said, is a big opportunity, for organizations to look at not just getting people back to work, but also taking it a step further and and improving that workplace for the future to be ready for any future waves of this pandemic or any other incidents that may come up that may require that business continuity.
Stavros, I have a question from the audience, if I could. Peter's asking about privacy and confidential information, documents and so forth with working from the home. If you have any thoughts on that, is that an insurance issue? Obviously it's a policy issue, but have you got any experience or any insight for us on that?
Yeah, for sure. That's something that has come up quite a bit, from clients. It's definitely a big issue. We've seen an increase in that activity over the last couple of months in cyber threats. Obviously, because everybody is working remotely, people are working like from their home, using their personal Wi-Fi, for example. So yeah, there's a number of things that can be done. For example, using VPN, using secure networks like to share information. We do have within KPMG, a team that focuses on cybersecurity. And if there are any specific needs or questions, obviously I can get you connected with that team. I'm not an expert in cybersecurity myself, but this is something that my clients I'm talking to have brought up, and I think it's a significant issue for many clients.
Right. No, thanks for answering that. I mean, the whole concept of the VPN and people working on their own private, possibly unsecured home networks is massive, the one I never thought about. So thanks for answering that.
Yeah, and especially in terms of public networks, for example, like the advice is, never to use those, even if you can, unless you have VPN protection, because those are the easiest to crack down. But yeah, I mean, there is, not opening emails when, you don't know the sender, or like there's a weird email address that is coming from. There's a number of tips, out there. But yeah, this has become like a major issue, and I think it will continue so, especially because, as I said, we're going to be working, in a kind of a hybrid, environment for a while.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the framework before I move on into some other considerations?
So just to clarify, if a company or a civic town or city wanted to engage KPMG, there's a 400 point checklist behind these 23 key points. Is that what I heard, Stavros?
Yeah, that's correct. And
okay,
thanks for
great.
clarifying that, Kevin. Yes, so we have a detailed inventory of actions across these 23 categories. So it's 400 plus, where basically we go by line and see, first of all, is this, is this relevant for that organization? If it is relevant, it's relevant for most organizations. What are the potential gaps that organization may have against that action, and then what are some of the mitigation strategies that need to be put in place, to address those gaps or those challenges that exist. So the way that we work with our clients is walk them through that 400-line item and identify where they may have gaps or challenges and help them put together a plan to address those.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, and in terms of the application of the framework, there is a 4-step process that we follow. As I've mentioned earlier, returning to work is not a big bang approach. It's a phased and gradual process. And the same goes in terms of the planning, for returning to work. The first step is around understanding where you currently are. So where are you right now in terms of, returning to work? What are the guidelines from the government, in your province or where you operate? How are your people currently working? What are some of the challenges that you're currently facing, like with people working remotely? And, what's the ideal timeline for getting those people back to work? So understanding, where you currently are, what are some of the mandatory things you have to put in place, and what are some of the potential gaps against those mandatory actions is step number 1. Step number 2 is around developing like a plan, as I've mentioned just a minute ago, to address any such gaps that you identify through your current state assessment. And working to address and implement and execute, on that plan. And before reopening, it's very important to assess both your organizational as well as, physical, like from a building perspective, readiness to reopen. Have you put all the, health and safety measures in place? But also understanding the readiness of your people. So, and your people, there is a number of things to consider as well in terms of, their personal circumstance, whether they're productive at home, whether they're taking care of someone who's in a high-risk category, whether, they have kids that they cannot leave at school now with the schools being closed. It's a number of considerations. So it's important to understand the readiness of your people overall, but also individually, to return to work. Once all that is done, you go to step number 3, which is, the first wave of return. And some of organizations obviously have already started to do this. A lot of organizations are still, I would say, between, step 1 and step 2. The first wave of return, is very critical to get that right. Understand, whether after you've had some people back to the workplace, whether there have been any challenges, whether there have been any issues, and continuously learning from those and addressing them with each and every new wave, which is step number 4, basically, bringing more waves of people back to work. So I think that that learning process is continuous. So this is a 4-step process, but it continues throughout. So the communication with your people needs to be continuous. Monitoring and reporting, again, will need to be continuous throughout this cycle. And the objective from this process to create a plan that will allow people to gradually and safely, return to work, as well as mitigate and reduce the health and safety risk. Those are the 2 biggest objectives. So yes, you want people back, but you have to do it the right way, and you have to make sure that you don't cause more issues or create more risks by bringing people back without having those safety measures in place. And we'll share.
Sorry, Stavros. Just have a question from Anthony here. What emphasis levels does the plan put towards employees incorporating various COVID-19 screening technologies or apps? So, is there you haven't talked about yet, maybe you will, but I know there's various software and apps on the marketplace now for screening and checking in. Any thoughts around that?
Yes, and actually this is something that we currently have in place in the US with our US firm, and we're looking to bring in Canada as well as KPMG. I know there are a number of apps out there as well, like ServiceNow, for example, has an application around this. And I can only speak like from a KPMG perspective. As I said, we have developed this app in the US, which basically has two components. One is individuals are assessing like their own readiness and risk around returning to work. So going through the things that we've talked about earlier, going through the community risk, going through the individual risk, and the app will give them an assessment of where they are in terms of returning to work and how risky that will be. It also provides organizations and managers with a dashboard and an overall view of their different locations and their different employee groups and the risk involved with those groups as well. So that's something that we are currently working to bring to market here as well. Yeah, I mean, outside of the app component, which I think is an important part, there's a physical component. And, we've seen a number of things there outside of just the basic, the PPE, equipment. We've seen organizations, for example, put thermal cameras in place, to measure like the temperatures of people. Or using infrared technology, right? Again, this is not widespread by any means, but it does help with, the feeling of employees around, all the precautions being, put in place to enable a safe return. So it's not mandatory for you to do some of those things. If you wanted to do them, it would just help your workforce to feel, safer coming back to the workplace.
Stavros, do you find that these teams, are they hybrids of like HR and IT, or what's your experience with regards to who's really forming the backbone teams that are really making these decisions and driving policy? Any suggestions around that?
Yes, I think I touched upon it briefly earlier. These are really cross-functional teams. HR plays a key role. Employment law plays a key role and I'm going to talk in a bit about some of the employment law considerations. Health and safety, IT obviously it plays an important role. The back office functions in general, because they're the ones mostly affected, by these. For many organizations are involved in these. Your legal and risk groups as well. So we see this really being like a team effort across a number of different departments. And that's why there is a task force that has representation from those different departments.
Great, thank you. Dan, did you have a question? Dan?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Stavros, what are your thoughts around how to be prepared to plan for if the potential of a second wave? Have you guys given that some consideration in the plan as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very, very important question, Dan, because it is likely that there might be like another outbreak, and we've taken that into consideration in a number of different ways. Number one, we said earlier that looking at what the government is doing, the guidelines, that the government is providing, it's a big prerequisite like for the return to work. But going beyond that, once you start bringing people back, and let's say you hit a second wave, this is why you need to have like the right protocols in place. what do you do if a second wave hits, right? How do you enable people to continue working, if that second wave hits? Do you send everybody back home right away, or do you only do that when there is like an outbreak? So there's a number of different questions that need to be answered, and obviously some of them are the answer to those questions will come from like the government and health official guidelines. For example, around how many people need to get sick, for that to be considered an outbreak, right? So currently, I think that's 5 people. That might change in the future. If it's 5 people, do you shut down the whole building, or do you shut down like just that floor, for example, right? I think right now it's just the floor. So there's a number of those considerations that need to be entered and added into your protocols for dealing with potential outbreak.
Gotcha. So have that consideration, be aware of it, but keep an eye on what the government's recommending so you can adjust as you're getting effective information about it.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing here, is that you can't do this in isolation of what the government is recommending, because some of those things are mandatory.
Gotcha. Great. Thanks, Stavros.
Good question.
Yeah. This brings me to the employment law considerations, for the return to work. And I think as a preface, I'm going to say that I'm not an employment lawyer. And so I'm going to share some of the learnings that I have around these considerations. But if you do have questions around these, please talk to your legal counsel. We also have an employment lawyers, a couple of employment lawyers at KPMG as well that I can connect you with, if you have any additional questions. But, the 3 main considerations from an employment law perspective, the first one is around recalling employees from a layoff. And, you have to be aware that there are some procedural requirements that may vary, by province. So some provinces, for example, the employers don't need to provide any notice, for recalling employees from layoff. In most provinces, you have to provide like a written notice. In Alberta, for example, you have to provide 7 days notice. And this is important because if you don't do it the right way, you could be sued from your employee for constructive dismissal. So it's an important thing to take into consideration. The second employment law consideration is around work refusals. So many people might say, like, I just don't feel comfortable. I'm too afraid to come back to work. And there are different reasons, like for work refusals. Many may do it just because the CRB might be just better for them right now. But, when it comes to occupational health and safety, employees have the right to both ask questions in terms of the precautions that organizations are taking to ensure their safety, as well as to refuse work if they consider it to be high risk, or if it's gonna put like their family members at risk. So there are some work refusals that are absolutely legitimate, and organizations need to have in place, the right explanations around the measures that they're taking, to ensure that their employees are safe. And then from, an accommodation and family status perspective, employers here need to consider the personal circumstances of their employees, whether they're taking care, again, of someone at home who might be high risk, or, whether they cannot leave their home, their kids at home unattended, for example, just because they don't go to school anymore. Again, the family status of an individual could be grounds for discrimination. So you could be sued if you take action based on the family status of an individual. So it's important to take the right steps and the right precautions, and make sure you hear your employees on this front.
Stavros, I have a question from Nicole. She's asking, what are some of the ethical implications being debated beyond government mandates, like requiring employees to use personal devices, being screened or monitored? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, personal devices, can we get a clarification? Like, meaning, I'm not sure what is being meant by that portion.
Second here. Nicole, I've unmuted you. Nicole, do you want to maybe clarify your question there? She may not. Phone paid for personally, like if employers, now maybe they're working from home, are they using their phone now? They don't have an office phone, so is there any things going on where companies are now paying for employees' cell phones because now they're using them from a home environment?
Yeah. I mean, we've seen a number of those examples where organizations are covering some of those expenses, like for employees. That used to happen, obviously, before COVID, and now it happens even more because employees will need to use, in some cases, like their personal device, like for work reasons. There is a big cyber component to this as well, like and technology like component in terms of making sure that you don't share any work-related information through those personal devices, maybe outside of accessing like your email. So there's a number of those considerations as well, and I'm not an expert in that on that side of things, for me to be able to talk in detail. But yeah, it's something that we do see with with different clients.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay. Any more questions, Kevin?
That's it. That's it for now. Thank you.
Okay. We've talked a lot about the health and safety portion earlier, and I just wanted to share that the 4 key health and safety mitigation measures that any organization can take, and those are access controls for employees, visitors, and vendors coming in. In some cases, we've seen employees and visitors and vendors needing to sign a declaration form before entering a building, or as I've mentioned earlier, their temperature might need to be taken, or like there is restrictions around how many employees or visitors enter an elevator, for example. So and there is other restrictions around before COVID hit, you could go, for example, into any floor directly. Now we see like you might need to go into reception first, wait there, and then someone will get you to your floor. So there's different restrictions. Different organizations are implementing like different measures just to ensure that there's like the right flow, of people across the different floors, and to reduce the risk of them coming like in contact. It's the same also with common use areas like kitchens or meeting room areas. Again, like there's some restrictions there. And this touches on number 2 around the physical distancing as well. So as you know, individuals need to be 6 feet apart. The same goes with their desks as well. So you have to reconfigure your physical space to make sure that employees are seated at least 6 feet apart, and anybody that may come in contact with them has at least like that distance between them. Personal protective equipment needs to be available and handed out, especially in cases where that physical distancing is not possible. That becomes even more critical to make sure that you have that PPE in place, like for everyone. And then the workplace cleaning and hygiene, like how frequently are you gonna be, should you be cleaning like your spaces? It's not like before, it used to be like maybe once a day. Now you may need to do it like a number of times a day, and have a protocol, around that. In terms of next steps, the first step is start building, your action plan if you haven't done so. We'll be happy to assist, with this. We're happy to have a conversation with you in more detail on this. I've already mentioned like our detailed playbook that we have in support of this guide, which elaborates on those 23 areas of our return to work. But whether you do this with KPMG or not, this is something that you need to do. You have to have like an action plan in place, to address any challenges or gaps that you may have, around return to work.
One question, Stavros, Peter's asking if the guidelines address working parents who are at home. Anything about parenting from home and how to fix the workplace there?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So in terms of the guidelines explicitly, mentioning that I haven't seen, but I did mention earlier that, the family status of someone is an important, consideration, even from a legal employment law perspective, in bringing somebody back to work. So it is already part of the legislation, and employers have the responsibility to understand, those personal requirements of employees, and understand whether they're able to or not, come back to work, depending on their family situation, whether they have like the right schooling and support, for their kids. So it's not explicitly, from what I know, maybe somebody else may have like a different insight on this. It's not explicitly called out in the guideline, but obviously there's guidelines around schooling as well, so those may change too. But it is a consideration like for employers.
Yeah, I know I was exposed to a company last week that said if there was a single parent at home with a child, they weren't allowed to work. And so that raised a little bit of, I don't know if it was a red flag, but definitely an interesting flag, saying that, okay, well, can you tell me I can't do my job because my child is here? So I think there's a whole bunch of new questions that are going to come out of this with regards to parenting and how do we manage that now, right? So
yeah, and it's not black and white. I think organizations, can't do everything, right? Like, but what they can do is, provide options or solutions, like for their employees. So one thing, for example, that I've heard, or a couple of examples that I can share with you from other organizations. One organization is thinking of hiring like a teacher or a number of teachers, to be able to provide like for their employees' kids, who are out of school right now and, may not have anything to do for 8 hours a day. Even while working remotely, they can, they're looking to provide, that teacher access, even through Zoom, in support of their employee kids. Like, that's one thing. The other thing is around daycare options, right? So that's an additional thing that, employers, are looking safe daycare options where, employees can potentially, leave their kids and go to work. That it used to exist before, COVID, but obviously it's become more of a necessity, with the return to work.
great. That's a great example. Really, really valuable example. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and I have a couple more slides here, and then I think we'll open up, for questions. So refusing to work, is a big buzzword right now that I've been hearing a lot. And this comes not just though from employees refusing to go back to work. It also comes from organizations that don't want to return to their old ways of working. Like, this is a unique opportunity to take advantage of some of the positives that are coming, with this pandemic. For example, overnight, people or organizations that were not able to work, remotely or virtually managed to make that happen, either using, Microsoft Teams or Google Hangouts or, Zoom. That happened practically overnight. If you had to have a project like beforehand, it would have taken you, I don't know, weeks and months, to be able to implement. So accelerated IT delivery and the digital aspect are gonna be big, big players, of the future in terms of, returning to work. We need to learn from that and be able to execute quickly, going forward in terms of, those technology implementations. Another perspective in terms of, refusing to return to the old ways of working is, how do I continue to enable, maybe 50% of my people to continue working from home and effectively provide, that technology, but also, mental support for my employees to continue working from home. There is a big component here around employer value proposition and the brand of the organization. So what's your brand, in these crazy times that we live in? How are you, supporting your employees through that, whether it's, through mental health programs or mindfulness programs or school support programs or whatever, right? So all those things are gonna help shape, your brand and your employer value proposition. And I think one more example of this list is around the, the poverty footprint. Many of the organizations that I'm talking to, they were planning expansions, for their buildings and getting more floors or other buildings. And now they're saying, we don't think we need it because, we can still have a fairly sizable proportion of our employees at any point in time working virtually. Also, that means that maybe we don't need to pay as much money for travel as well. So there's those considerations that were not very prominent before, before COVID, that are some of the advantages, from COVID that organizations are looking to include into their, returning to work plan. And yeah, the last slide that I have here is around, the new reality. I think, we've touched upon these, quite a bit throughout, but, this covers everything that I've been talking about in terms of, driving work more efficiently, getting to your customers, maybe not just through in-person interactions, but through digital channels as well. Accelerating like these behavioral changes that otherwise may have taken like years to be implemented, but now can be implemented quite quickly because people have been forced to work in those ways. And, they got used to it for the last couple of months. So why not build on that and leverage that? So I wanted to leave you with these considerations and, potential areas for investment. Mostly it's around digital, those technology tools. There's things like automation, for example, as well, that is becoming pretty popular right now because organizations realize that, maybe not all of the administrative work needs an individual in person in the office to do that work. Why can't we just automate some of that? I think the last thing here is, it's also been an opportunity for us to look at, our policies overall, especially around inclusiveness. such as including like remote working employees. And you know, those things, those changes are only going to make an organization better, I think, in the, you know, in the long run. Yeah. And this is where it's a lot of things.
Well, yeah, a lot of information there, Stavros. Thank you. Thanks so much. We'll open it up. Anybody who wants to ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll allow you to talk one by one. I know there's been a lot of questions already. One question I have, Stavros, that maybe you could answer is, it seems like there's, well, no, it doesn't seem it is, there's a lot of disparity across each province in Canada with regards to the rules and regulations and even how the approach to COVID has been. Do you see that changing if there's a second wave, that there'll be more alignment province to province, or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's hard to predict whether there will be, you know, more alignment or not. But one thing that's for sure is, and I hope that this happens, is everybody is learning through this first wave in terms of how things have been deployed, both in terms of the government guidelines as well as, you know, how the organizations have operated during this time. And I hope because of those learnings that we learn from other provinces as well, and, you know, federally as well as globally, and, you know, we try to implement like the leading practices. So that should bring, I think, naturally bring like provinces closer together. You know, that at least would be my hope.
Yeah, great, thank you. Any other questions here? We've addressed a lot. I know one question I had from Joey was if KPMG or yourself had any idea as to which markets might emerge early. You know, like for instance, we don't know if we can go to the US. Is there any other markets you feel UK might open up for us earlier as opposed to later?
Mm-hmm. I think that probably is consistent with where those countries are in terms of the pandemic and how quickly, you know, they've moved over from the pandemic. I think we've seen East Asia obviously, you know, being like the first to come out of that. But I mean, obviously they're not fully out of it, and there is some, you know, new outbreaks there. But you know, they've been the first ones like to return to the workplace. I think, you know, parts of Europe, you know, will come next. You know, the US, I'm not sure. It's hard to predict, but you know, they may be last, I think, to come out of this because obviously it's they've been heavily impacted, and you know, it's a huge country as well. I do hope that they do come out quickly out of these because obviously we're very dependent on their economy.
Absolutely. Great. Dan, any questions, comments from you, Dan?
No, I just thanks so much for this, guys. I think it was really good in terms of giving us an idea of what a framework needs to look like. There's still a lot of unanswered questions, but I think with the framework we can start digging in and really determining what they are in our own unique context. So that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks. Stephanie, anything from your side?
Yeah, just one question, Stavros. You know, you kind of talked about the working from home movement and how it's positioned to continue to grow. How are businesses balancing looking after their employees' mental status and this desire to push? Like, but people are working harder, they're working longer, they're working all the time. There really isn't much differentiation anymore between the work and home life. Have you seen any really great examples of how businesses are helping their employees manage that?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a few examples, and it's hard. I don't know if anybody has fully figured that out, right? Because for sure, and I felt this myself, like it's a busy time when you're working remotely, right? Like my computer is, you know, 2 feet from my bed. So, you know, I go to it straight after I get up, and then, you know, you stay there like for hours. Much longer probably, and many more hours than you would if you were physically in the office. I've seen a number of things that organizations have been doing. A lot of organizations have been increasing their spend on mental health and on the benefits they provide, to their employees. They've also been providing like a lot of free resources and webinars and things like that around mental health and mindfulness. At KPMG, we've had a lot of those, and we also have a chief mental health officer, which I think shows the importance that we put and the value that we put like on mental health, within our organization. I've seen companies also, and we do this here as well, but like have virtual lunches or dinners, obviously staying in touch like with their employees, or offering them like to pay their their dinner or their takeout. That's something that I've heard from a few clients that they do with with their employees. They didn't used to do that before COVID, but now they understand how important that is. So if they can make employees forget about paying for dinner for one night a week, or one night every 2 weeks, that's still like I think greatly appreciated by most people. So yeah, there's things and things like that that I've seen. Has anybody managed this perfectly? I think it's very hard. But it's around staying close to your employees, hearing like their feedback, how they're feeling, having like those pulse checks with them, and those more frequent interactions with them.
Stavros, just a comment from one of the attendees, just thanking you and KPMG for consolidating everything into one document here. So I echo that. All the webinars I do, and we do a lot of them, we had 79 registrations, and we had 72 online at one point. So the amount of people who actually logged on today to hear this is really amazing, almost 100% attendee rate. So thank you so much for sharing this vital information. And I just want to iterate that if there's companies out there online here that do need KPMG support, definitely please reach out to Stavros. And said they have their 400-point checklist, which will be customized for you or your industry and company. And again, I think we can do as coaches, Dan or myself, and of course Stephanie there, who's been getting the word out and working with companies to get their message out, because getting the message out right now that we're open and that we're ready for business is going to be as critical as anything. So thanks to all you panelists. There will be a poll we'll send out tomorrow. We're always, as coaches and business professionals, really want to make sure that we're giving value. And if there's any other questions, you'll be able to write that in the poll as well, and we'll get back to you. So thanks to all the panelists. Stavros, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Stavros. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. See you later, everybody. Bye.